Into our final segment of the day here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. But before we get into our final segment of the day, we've gotten 3 quick comments straight away. As Tap to Learn says, Kirk O'Chain's prime time curse gets broken. Well, the funny thing is, I think it already has been broken. He's won 4 of his past 5 primetime starts, led an impressive game-winning drive against Philly the last time out in primetime for this Atlanta Falcons team. So, I think it's already been lifted. And tonight, it's a tougher matchup, but who knows? If he can keep it close, if this kind of ball control heavy offense for Atlanta can dominate the time of possession game, then it can be a game. And Andre, on the other hand, has a question about his fantasy football team. Flex Christian Kirk or Kareem Hunt this week. It is time to drop Mark Andrews. And I agree with that. Mark Andrews has not looked impressive thus far this season. Done a lot more blocking, to be honest with you, than catching the football. As for the Christian Kirk or Kareem Hunt question, as much as I've bashed Christian Kirk on this show, he's the right answer here. I think that the Chiefs' running back situation is very, very screwy. As Tap to Learn says, Higher Baby by Creed. Great song. Don't necessarily get the reference, but, it's a great song anyways. But getting back to Andre's question here, Christian Kirk or Kareem Hunt, I think it's Christian Kirk, to be honest with you. And a couple of weeks ago, I probably would have been telling you to flex Christian Kirk or even start Christian Kirk, but, he's proved me wrong in some regards. As a receiver who stepped up, is one of the better route runners on this team. That's the thing with Jacksonville. If they just had better route running receivers, then Trevor Lawrence would have easier throws to make. He wouldn't necessarily have to be as reliant on his deep ball as we expect. And Christian Kirk has been that. He's not just speed anymore to me. He's someone who I can now look at and say, oh, I now see tape where he's running very nice routes. It's just a matter of, getting targeted, getting catches, and getting yardage and fantasy points. So flexing Christian Kirk would be a very nice option, and I agree that Mark Andrews has really been perhaps the disappointment of the season at the tight end position. But let's talk a little bit, not necessarily getting to a more morbid, as Tap Turner says, it's Kirk Cousins' signature song. As a Texas Rangers fan, I can tell you that is our signature song as well that fueled our 2023 World Series run, but I digress. We have to get into our injury report to close out today's show for this upcoming week. And the injury report, we're getting a little bit more volatile, a little bit more sketchy, so to speak, because we don't necessarily know a lot of information about some of these injuries. But for the most part, you've known the story of injuries like Kupp's, Nakua's, McCaffrey's, Samuel's. These injuries that have been happening over the past couple of weeks, are more short-term, so you're going to have to look out. But then, of course, the Rashee Rice injury as well. But we'll start off with an injury that is more short-term. Perhaps as short-term as not missing any time, but with this guy, you never know. It's Anthony Richardson. Anthony Richardson goes down with a hip injury last week against the Steelers. Joe Flacco comes in, not off the couch this time, actually off the Colts bench, and delivers a decent performance. So, if it were Joe Flacco starting for the Colts, I wouldn't necessarily worry if I were a Colts fan. I would actually be a bit happy because the wide receivers look as good as they've ever been. Michael Pittman had a season high in yards. Alec Pierce now looks like he could be a vertical threat in this game, like I mentioned. And suddenly, this offense, much like what with Carolina saw with the whole Andy Dalton situation, could be rejuvenated. But the thing is, it could only be for one game. He is still day-to-day. I haven't heard any kind of reports from whether it be the Colts camp, ESPN, what have you, about which quarterback will start. What I can say, he's at very least day-to-day. But with him, they probably don't want to rush him back if he's not necessarily fully healthy because of what happened last season. So Anthony Richardson, I think it's safe to say that you should bench him. I wouldn't necessarily have started him anyways as a true starter in any league right now because of the fact that he is boom or bust. But that's the situation with him. And Joe Flacco might, as a result, be a nice little stream for you as well. But then let's go to another weird injury here, because I don't necessarily know how the fantasy implications of this one works out, because he's not, as valuable. He is still a fun asset to that Saints offense. It's Taysom Hill with the abdomen injury. He's unsure if time will be missed. I think this is very similar to the Richardson situation, where if he's not fully healthy, you keep him out. But there really isn't any fantasy implications surrounding, as Andre said, is Henry untradeable now, seeing the offense run through him? Yeah, I think he now is. And it's funny because I was very, very wrong about him to start the year. I was very low on this. It's one of those acquisitions in the offseason that I absolutely did not like for the Ravens, because I loved, when they were healthy, the committee approach of both Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins in that room. I thought that it was a lot of fun to watch all three of them and Jackson just wreak havoc in the run game on opposing defenses. And I was like, if Derrick Henry really the answer to really supplement Lamar Jackson? Turns out he is. I was completely wrong about him. And in fantasy football, he is untradeable. I think that, as the season goes on, he's only going to get more touches, only going to get more comfortable in this offense. And he's proven that he still has it. And other aging running backs, like Chubb, hurt, Kamara, topsy-turvy performance to start the season. So right now, Henry is kind of carrying the load for 30-plus running backs right now, and it's refreshing to see, because I love to be proved wrong, especially in this kind of situation, but, it is what it is. And this goes to show how deep the fantasy football pool right now is. Going back to the injury status of Taysom Hill, I don't necessarily think you have to worry. You have many Saints on your team, like Kamara, like Olave, like perhaps Shaheed. I don't necessarily worry. As Andre said, would you start Garrett Wilson or Brian Thomas this week? Just because of, the whole London situation and the acclimation period, I would start Brian Thomas, because I think Garrett Wilson is going to be affected as much as Justin Jefferson. And, I don't necessarily see how, if, the whole tension between him and Rodgers is carrying over, how it will stop immediately in just one game, especially an overseas contest. That's just my advice. Brian Thomas, isn't someone who I would immediately pick over someone who is still a star wide receiver in Garrett Wilson, but at least for this week, going up against the Colts defense that is average at best, hopefully Brian Thomas shows out, because I have high hopes for this kid. I love this kid in this Jacksonville Jaguars offense. It's just a matter of, whether or not this Jacksonville Jaguars offense can get anything going. Whether, Trevor Lawrence stops feeling so much pressure. So that's the question, really. Let's get back briefly to the injury that really shook the league. We actually just got update on my phone from the NFL Network saying that Rashee Rice was placed on the IR. Let's talk about how this truly impacts fantasy football. And it really impacts the Chiefs, because if you think about it, they haven't really been strong in the run game, even with Pacheco. Worthy, he's a fun player. I love Xavier Worthy as much as the next Texas fan or person in general to watch. Travis Kelce, he's someone who you just can't help but appreciate for what he's done in the league as a tight end over the past decade or so. But it's looking dire right now in Kansas City. And it's a season-ending injury for Rashee Rice. I think this trip on the IR pretty much seals that fate. So it's ultimately up to you to kind of determine whether or not you can really trust a guy like Xavier Worthy, who's much more of a gadget kind of player than a true wide receiver one, than anyone else in this team. Because Travis Kelce, as much as I love him, as much as we saw that he can still have the occasional good game, he hasn't really looked himself. And he can't be expected to carry that much of a load in terms of target share in this offense. Especially if they're not going to lean as heavily on the run game. Let's go to show, that by signing Kareem Hunt, it's not necessarily a position that the Chiefs are too worried about, and that's kind of scary. Because you kind of need right now at least a complimentary running back to help. Because Kareem Hunt, I don't really like at this stage of his career. as someone who is, at best, a workhorse back. As Tapton says, your boy Worthy gets fed, Kelsey wakes up, damn Chiefs adjust. We'll see. Because if there's any team that you shouldn't down in the league, it's Kansas City, because of the way they just find ways to win. But right now, it's looking bleak. I can't say that because Patrick Mahomes as well. And he's acknowledged this himself. He acknowledged that he's not playing the best. And when we see it on the field, we see the turnovers that have taken a huge rise, a meteoric rise for him and his standards to start the season. As Tapton says, Reed figures it out by week 7 or 8. We'll see. That's all I can really say right now. And Tapton says it's not sooner. Again, I'll have to see it to believe it. Because right now, the Chiefs are a team that, yes, continue to find ways to win. But I just don't see it. And this injury is really. But just some quick hitters here. The Christian Watson injury, the high ankle sprain, shouldn't be out for as long as Andre said. I have 2 IR spots being used by Brooks and Pacheco. Do I drop Brooks so I can place Rice on IR? Yes, because I think what I hear out of the Panthers camp of things, Brooks is starting to recover pretty decently. He's been on the PUP list for a bit longer than expected, but I could see him coming back. To see him being a nice little supplementary piece to the shocking Chuba Hubbard, if Andy Dalton continues to be the back. So I would say placing Rice on IR is a smart move, and Brooks could eventually be a nice piece for your fantasy team after he comes back as well. With Christian Watson getting back to him, the high ankle sprain, I think, it was tested Monday. Could be placed on IR himself, but I don't think that this injury for the Packers is really that detrimental. But you know what you think. But here's another note. I said about the Brooks injury, that he could be in practices for the Panthers. 2 other players, very popular fantasy players. TJ Hawkinson from the Minnesota Vikings could come back from the PUP list. And Chubbs, be wary of them. If someone hasn't already drafted them, hoping that they will be back sooner off the PUP list than expected, then be very aggressive on the waiver wires in that regard. Because this is the time when all these PUP players can be eligible to come back to practice. So watch out for that. But that will just about do it for this edition of the GSMC Fantasy Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for your lovely comments. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network as a whole for allowing us to host the show. But with that being said, I've been Chris Shepard. Thank you all. Like, follow, and subscribe to the show and the network as a whole if you so choose. Keep on making yourselves available to the comment section. As Andre also says, I'm trying to trade for running back right now. It's looking bad. Hopefully, that will get fixed for you immediately, my man. But thank you all for watching. As he says, my backups are Ramondre and White. Those are decent backups. I wouldn't necessarily worry about that. So hopefully you can find another guy to supplement that. But that will just about do it for the show. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you, Andre, saying great show today. We're back tomorrow, 3:30 p.m. Eastern, to close out the week. But without further ado, I am out for today.